Thanks for staying with us on politics tonight. Was it speaking on the state of security in the country, especially in the first quarter? We're looking at a report by Beacon Consulting. We're joined by the CEO of Beacon Security and Intelligence Limited, Dr. Kabir. Thanks for staying with us.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to continue from where you stopped. You were talking about the increase or the rise in kidnapping cases. It would seem like there is a season or period where insecurity rises to its peak, and there are other times where it will seem as though not even a fly is hurt. For example, like you've mentioned, kidnapping, or terrorism, whether in the northeast or the northwest, as well as other regions in the country. Recently, like we've seen, people were being taken, in buses. Transportation became the method for kidnapping. Can this be studied, and proactive measures put in place?
Definitely. So kidnapping, essentially, it's a crime. And criminologists have studied crimes and have put forward different theories on how to manage these types of crime. So as an example, most kidnappers, especially kidnap for ransom, let's not forget that there are different types of kidnap occurrences, but the most common one in Nigeria is kidnapping for ransom, as against, for instance, where the intention is to harvest body organs. The what types we have in Nigeria are mostly for ransom, but in the southwest of the country and a few other parts, you still see the types of kidnap where the objective is to harvest body organs. So for kidnapping for ransom, we can essentially separate the actions into three, and the mitigation measures can also be divided into three. Number one, the reason for the abduction. Why do the perpetrators, why do they go into a kidnap for ransom? Depending on what part of the country you are in, sometimes the reason is political, other times it's economic, and then, of course, other times it's social. When I say political, and I say this with all sense of responsibility, it could be to embarrass the government. So when they do mass abduction, that is one of the objectives. The other one is economic. They're interested in the ransom. And there are several reasons why they're interested in the ransom. It could be to, for their pockets to be bigger so that they can do whatever they want to do with the money, or depending on their affiliations, they may want to use the proceeds to buy weapons or even buy influence. Then social. Some of the bandit commanders, the moment they engage in that type of mass abduction, their profile increases. They become like bigger commanders within the group. So it now becomes a competition among the different commanders. Who is going to abduct more students, as an example, so that his or her profile can increase. His anyway, because there are no female commanders. Now, that's an example of the reasons. The second one is the collection of the proceeds of the kidnap for ransom. In other words, the ransom. They are interested in that ransom. And most times they are able to collect that ransom. So in criminology, one of the simplest things you can do is to make it difficult for them to collect that ransom. Or the first one, make it difficult for them to carry out the abduction. In other words, increase protection around the targeted areas. If it's schools, increase protection around schools. If it is along travel routes, increase protection around travel routes. Or, of course, if for any reason we allow them to still collect the ransom. By the way, the president today released an op-ed in an international newspaper, and he stated his government's stance on non-payment of ransom, which has been mentioned severally in the past. So we know that as an example, going forward, this government will remain along that line of non-payment of ransom. And so perhaps in the long run, this will incentivize kidnap for ransom. The last one is the consequences for engagement in the kidnap for ransom. In other words, how many of them have we arrested? How many of them have we prosecuted? And this, I think, is the major reason why you are seeing perhaps an increase in instances of kidnap for ransom, because the prosecution rate is very, very low. As a practitioner, and I'm sure as a media person, it's not common that you see the prosecution. Sometimes you see the police arresting them, but very rarely do we see instances where they are taken to court, they are prosecuted, and then, of course, the prosecution is covered in the media to show, would-be abductors that this is the consequences for abduction. Of course, the other one we can talk about is the ease with which they collect the ransom, and then even they're able to spend that ransom. Now, until we put a scenario or situation where we make it very difficult for them to collect that ransom, or even where they collect the ransom, we go after them, even if it takes years, we arrest them, we prosecute them. Now, unless we do all of this, unfortunately, the kidnap or ransom industry will continue to thrive.
So you, from what you just said, you mentioned two things, and I want to follow up on that. The first one you talked about was the prosecution rate. And I wanted to ask you, what is responsible for that? Why haven't we seen that level of prosecution of this terrorist?
So it's principally a failure of our law enforcement agencies. I'll take you back to 2015 when President Buhari was his first term in office, and he was in his inaugural speech. President Buhari told us as Nigerians that he realizes that most of our law enforcement agencies don't even have evidence rooms. Something as simple as an evidence room. No matter how much, as a judge, no matter how much I hate a suspect, if the prosecution does not convince me as a judge of the guilt of that suspect, it will be difficult for me to prosecute him on the basis of that sentiment. And so if we don't have evidence room, I mean, you see it every day in the news where when our law enforcement agents go to crime scenes, they use their bare hands. There is the infamous story of the person who handled the case of the bombing, the Nyanya bombing in, I think, 2014 or 2015. You recall when a vehicle borne improvised explosive device detonated at a park in Abuja. Now, the law enforcement officer who handled that case, they were able to retrieve the steering wheel of that particular vehicle. And then he kept it in his office. Every time you go to visit him, you point to the steering wheel and say, that is the steering wheel from the vehicle that was detonated. And naturally, most people who go to that office will touch it. And in that process, between himself and the people who touch it, they would have destroyed the fingerprint of whoever, the suspect or the person who was responsible for either, putting the bomb together or for driving the vehicle to that location. So most of our law enforcement agents lack evidence rooms. In fact, the process of collection and retrieving of evidences is almost missing. That standard operating procedure. I mean, you watch movies, in foreign movies, you see how they meticulously gather those evidence. They don't use their bare hands. They put it in bags, seal those bags, and then take it and log it in those evidence rooms. Anytime those evidence are being retrieved, there is a process for that. And then, of course, those are the things that will be presented to a competent court of jurisdiction to show the judge that that particular suspect is guilty of that offense. Now, in our own instance, we lack that almost in its totality. And like I said, in 2015, the then president promised it. We're in 2024 now. I urge you to try to find out from all our law enforcement agencies. Very few of them have, this evidence rooms or even the standard operating procedures for collecting the evidence. The second one is corruption, unfortunately. As much as I hate to say this, it is a factor. The infamous case, which is still in court, so I don't want to go deep into it, the case of Abba Kyari and what happened after his arrest or the detention of a particular individual, and how the evidence that was supposed to help in the prosecution of that individual was tampered with. Because the case is still in court, let's not be sub judice and discuss it. But that's an instance of tampering of evidence because of alleged corruption. There are several other instances like that. And then, of course, the other one is the likelihood of influence by political actors who, for one reason or the other, sometimes interfere with the judicial process so that the victims, I mean, the case of Wadume is one of them. Of course, we can also discuss the cultural, sentiments around certain localities within Nigeria, where even when persons are guilty, they seek to protect them because of ethnic or sometimes religious affiliation. So these are some of the reasons why prosecution is extremely low in Nigeria.
And the second thing you mentioned, which I also want to follow up on, is the ease with which ransom is collected. So I was going to ask you what our current success rate is in tracking perpetrators, illicit finances, monitoring the movement of resources, motorcycles, cell phones used by these criminals?
So let me kind of disaggregate. You've said a lot. Let me start from the collection of proceeds through their financial institutions. I hate to say that we've not done much. There is a lot more that needs to be done. And I'm quite excited by some of the developments I've seen in the last few weeks or months. As an example, when people are told to tie their BVN to their NIN, that's an example. Some of the other areas, because time would not allow me to go deeper into the issue, anyone who is interested in this topic should pick up the GERBA report of their last assessment on Nigeria. That GERBA report, GERBA is an arm of ECOWAS, and they do member states' evaluation to see their compliance with anti-terrorism provisions and the financial institutions. And then, of course, they work closely with our regulatory agencies, NFIU, the Central Bank of Nigeria, name them. So they released the report, and they showed clearly about 70% of the vulnerabilities that exist within that sector for financing terrorism and for kidnap for ransom is within the financial sector. And just to give you an indication of that, most banks do not implement fully the KYC component, know your customer component. Then, of course, the identities, especially the biometrics of most customers, is not even available. So those are areas that we need to improve upon. And I said, if I remember well, they released about 14 indicators within that report. And as far as I know, we've only implemented about 3. So we still have about 11 more to implement if we're going to at least beat our chest to say we've done a lot. Another example is the proportion of contract workers that exist within, especially our commercial banks. That is a vulnerability. As a risk manager, when I look at those vulnerabilities, I ask myself, how do we reduce that vulnerability? For as long as we allow those contract staff to remain, almost about 70% of the workforce of our commercial banks are contract workers. They are lowly paid. Their loyalty and allegiance to the banks are extremely low because they are essentially not the staff of those banks. And it's very easy, for instance, for anyone to incentivize them. The other element, which is also crucial, is the existence of certain banks. I don't even know what name to call them, but they are banks that allow the opening of accounts with ease. So as an example, all you need sometimes is just to show any type of ID card, and then they allow you to operate an account. I don't want to mention any names so that we're not viewed for, spoiling anyone's market. But those banks exist, they're there. And I think the responsibility is on the Central Bank of Nigeria as a regulator, and of course the NFIU to look closely at that and ensure that those banks collect the relevant documents before they allow the opening of the banks. I think they are called digital banks or something like that. And they are very common. They are the most popular banks at the moment, especially by small and medium scale industries at the moment. But we also know that the criminals also use them for the same purposes. So that's number one. The other component that you mentioned would include, for instance, the ease with which these abductors are able to collect this money. And so what they do is they exploit this vulnerability that I mentioned. As an example, someone who is being paid 75,000 or 100,000 or 120,000 as a contract worker, imagine a situation where they incentivize him with a percentage of the proceeds, maybe 5% of 10 million naira or even 20 or 30 million. It would take the heart of a lion for that person to resist that kind of temptation. So again, there are several vulnerabilities that exist within the financial sector that allow these criminals to continue to collect their ransom with the ease that they collect. Of course, the cashless policy has not been fully implemented. I know there has been progress from late last year, just before the elections up to now, where we've seen a reduction in the use of cash within the economy, but that challenge is still there. Today, I know that in certain places, cash is still available. Transactions of huge sums of money are being done in cash, and until that vulnerability is also blocked, these criminals will continue to exploit it.
You've talked about the role of the CBN to the banks, especially with illicit financial flows, but what about the NCC? Because some people will say, look, there is NIN, and then you have to register your lines. Of course, the BVN would have to do with the banks. And then, but we still have, criminal elements perpetrating crime and getting away with it without being caught. Why haven't our security agencies been able to leverage technology?
So there is a challenge within our national security architecture. Again, this is another thing that I would urge the president to look into. In today's world, in security, we talk about convergence. The physical world that you and I know where we exist and the cyber world have converged. It's almost impossible to speak of them as separate entities. We do a significant percentage of our transactions using our phones. So that's an example of how this convergence have happened. What you are moving is, to an extent, cash, which is physical cash, or you are using the cyberspace to do that. And so at the moment, there is a gap in our national security architecture, and that gap is in the cyberspace. A lot is being done in the cyberspace. Conversations are being had. Sometimes threats are being, conceived and planned within that cyberspace. The manifestation that you see is what you see in the physical space, but the planning, the intelligence that you can get before they happen is actually in the cyberspace. And at the moment, we do not have a functional cyberspace security infrastructure, if you allow me to use that word. There are components of it. So as an example, you may go to the DSS, you see a department. You go to NIA, you see a department. You go to the police, you see a department. But the type of relevance that cybersecurity plays in today's world, we do not have a functional, I would say, unit that exists within the security space. And I want the listener to understand what I'm trying to say. You have different MDAs that have ministries, departments, and agencies that have responsibility for security. We don't have a separate one for cybersecurity, despite the relevance of cybersecurity in today's world. In the past, there has been argument, as an example, to say, okay, maybe the NCC should create a unit. But I do not agree with that, for the simple reason that the mandate and philosophy behind the creation of the NCC is purely to support the growth of communication. Any suggestion that would allow Nigerians to feel that their private conversations is being tapped into by any element within the NCC would completely destroy that mandate for supporting the growth of communication within the country. So it cannot be the NCC. It has to be a separate unit that has mandate for security, that has the capacity to listen in and speak with the right support from a court of jurisdiction, as an example, because abuse can be very, very common in that field, especially in this era of politics, where that capability, for instance, can be used against the opposition, and it would completely, create the wrong impression that we want to create. So it has to be a neutral commission that is not affiliated with any of the existing commissions, that would have the capacity when it needs to eavesdrop, when it needs to look into certain components of the cyberspace, it would get the necessary warrant from a competent court of jurisdiction, and then do that for the protection of national interests and not for the projection of any political interest.
Dr. Kabir Adamu, it's always a pleasure to have you on. Your analysis is always quite interesting and brilliant. Thank you so much for your time tonight. The CEO, Beacon Consulting, Beacon Security and Intelligence Limited.
Thank you so much for having me.